Most people assume exploration is a solved problem. We've mapped the ocean floor, we've landed on the moon, we've got satellites photographing every square inch of the surface. Here's what those satellites actually show us. There are places so hostile, so remote, or so deliberately off limits that no human being has ever stood there. Not one. We know these places exist. We can see their outlines. We just can't get to them, or we're not allowed to, or we've tried, and the planet has made it abundantly clear that it would prefer we didn't. Here's a few of them. The Rub al-Khali occupies the southern third of the Arabian Peninsula and covers roughly 250,000 square miles, which makes it larger than France. It is the largest continuous sand desert on Earth. And its interior, the genuine deep center of it, has never been fully explored by any scientific expedition. Not documented, not surveyed, not visited in any systematic way. You might assume that enough crossing attempts over the years have given us a reasonable picture of what's in there. Here's the problem. Every expedition that has crossed any portion of it did so as quickly as possible, stayed as close to the edges as they could manage, and most of them barely survived the experience. The temperature during summer routinely reaches 56 degrees Celsius, or about 133 degrees Fahrenheit. At that heat, the sand itself radiates warmth upward, so you're being cooked from above and below simultaneously. There is no water, none whatsoever. Wilfred Thesiger, the British explorer who crossed portions of it in the late 1940s, described the experience as the most physically demanding of his life, and Thesiger had previously survived Sudan, Ethiopia, and the mountain regions of Iraq. Expeditions from the early 20th century documented going 8 or 9 days between water sources, surviving on whatever moisture they could extract from camels. The genuinely strange part is what scientists think might be buried underneath all of that sand. The regional geology suggests there are ancient river systems running beneath the dunes, some of them potentially hundreds of miles long, from a period when the Arabian Peninsula received substantially more rainfall than it does today. No one has been able to excavate deep enough in the interior to verify this. Because getting research equipment to the center of the Rub al-Khali is roughly as complicated as getting it to the surface of Mars. Some of the dunes are over 800 feet tall. They shift constantly. A route that looks passable this week may not exist in any recognizable form the following month. Deep in the western Amazon, near the border between Brazil and Peru, there is a protected territory called the Vale do Javari. It covers roughly 32,000 square miles, about the size of Austria, and the Brazilian government has officially closed it to outside visitors, not because of any geological hazard or physical impossibility, but because of the people inside it. There are more uncontacted indigenous communities living within the Vale do Javari than anywhere else on Earth. From everything FUNAI, the Brazilian government agency responsible for indigenous affairs, can determine those communities have no interest in contact and no interest in changing that arrangement. The territory is officially recognized as having the highest concentration of uncontacted peoples anywhere in the world. FUNAI monitors the territory primarily from aircraft. What their aerial surveys show is that these communities are functioning normally. Large communal buildings, cleared agricultural plots, people moving through daily routines without any apparent awareness of the world beyond their borders. Entry into the territory is illegal under Brazilian law. Getting caught inside results in criminal charges, and that assumes the entry goes smoothly, which it hasn't always. Multiple tribes within the territory have been documented defending their perimeter with arrows against approaching outsiders. Scientists working in adjacent accessible sections of the Amazon believe the Vale do Javari almost certainly contains dozens of plant and animal species not cataloged anywhere in scientific literature. There are river systems inside that haven't been mapped at any meaningful resolution. Species of fish, insects, and amphibians almost certainly exist in there that don't appear in any existing database. The Brazilian government has made a deliberate institutional decision that leaving the people there in peace matters more than documentation. We have the means to go in. we've chosen not to. Papua New Guinea covers a land area roughly the size of California and is one of the most biologically rich places on the planet. It is also one of the most consistently inaccessible. The Mamberamo Basin, in the far northwest of the country, is a particularly extreme example of both. It drains a river system covering around 8 million hectares, an area larger than Austria, and the vast majority of it has never been visited by any outside researcher, scientist, or explorer. The communities that have lived along its edges for generations have explored its margins. The interior remains untouched. That's how it has been, and that's unlikely to change. The terrain explains why. The basin is a massive lowland swamp surrounded by mountain ranges on 3 sides, with no obvious point of entry and no flat, stable ground for establishing a base once inside. During the wet season, which accounts for most of the year, large sections of the basin are underwater. The ground that isn't submerged is saturated enough to swallow heavy equipment. A scientific expedition in 1938 attempted to penetrate the interior and made it approximately 60 miles before the logistics collapsed. Rotting supply lines, contaminated water sources, an environment that was destroying equipment faster than it could be replenished. The expedition eventually turned around. No subsequent attempt has gotten significantly further, and the terrain hasn't improved. What scientists do know, based on aerial surveys and careful field work along the basin's accessible margins, is that the biodiversity inside is almost certainly extraordinary. In 2005 and 2008, research teams working near the basin's edges documented dozens of species new to science within weeks of arrival. New species of frogs, previously unrecorded birds, a honey-eater species that matched nothing in existing taxonomic records. Those discoveries came entirely from the reachable perimeter. The interior, the sections no expedition has physically entered, is widely believed to hold substantially more. Getting there requires either a multi-week river journey through genuinely hazardous water or a helicopter, with enough fuel capacity for the round trip from the nearest functional airstrip. Most researchers conclude that the accessible margins are sufficient. The center of the Mamberamo Basin stays exactly as it has always been. Architected creative writing section with structural specifications and word count precision. Beneath the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, running through the limestone bedrock under a jungle that most people wouldn't voluntarily spend an afternoon in, there is a flooded cave system that may be the longest in the world. The Sistema Sac Actun has been measured at over 215 miles of mapped passages. That number is provisional because explorers keep finding new sections. More to the point, the mapped portions represent only a fraction of what the system almost certainly contains. Every significant dive into its unmapped branches has revealed additional chambers, additional passages, additional forks that nobody has followed to their end. Cave diving in the Sac Actun system is an objective measure of how badly a person wants to find out what's in there. The visibility in unmapped sections can drop to near zero when sediment is disturbed. The passages narrow without warning. A diver who runs into a restriction a mile underground in the dark in water that is exactly 25 degrees Celsius and extremely clear right up until the moment it isn't, is dealing with a situation that has a hard ceiling on how much modern technology can help. Divers carry enough gas for the journey in plus the journey out, and then they carry a reserve margin on top of that. If they misjudge the distance or the restrictions or the navigation, that margin is the only thing that matters. What draws them back is partly the system's biological weirdness. The cave contains a population of creatures that have been adapting to permanent total darkness for so long that the process of adaptation has become, in some cases, complete and irreversible. There are species of blind cavefish in the Sac Actun system that no longer carry functional genes for eye development at all. The genes aren't suppressed. They're gone. Scientists found eyeless crustaceans in the deeper, older sections of the cave that show no morphological relationship to any surface-dwelling species currently known from the region, which raises the reasonable question of how long they've actually been down there. Nobody can answer that with any precision yet. The Greenland ice sheet covers roughly 80% of the island and reaches a thickness of more than 2 miles in some sections. Underneath it, completely sealed from any human access, there is a landscape that functions as a geological record of a world that predates modern climate conditions by millions of years. We know the broad shape of what's under there from radar surveys conducted by aircraft and ground-penetrating instruments pulled across the surface on sledges. The radar tells us there are mountains, canyons, and at least one river valley of substantial size buried under the ice. The detail those surveys can resolve is limited enough that the subglacial topography remains genuinely unmapped at any meaningful resolution. Here's what makes this stranger than it initially sounds. Scientists believe that when the ice eventually retreats, not if, but when, it will reveal a landscape that hasn't been in contact with the atmosphere since before humans existed as a species. The sediment under the deepest sections of the sheet has been accumulating undisturbed for somewhere between 2.7 and 3 million years. Plant material has been recovered from drill cores that was preserved well enough to suggest the land beneath was once a boreal forest, something like the forests of modern Canada. That forest has been under ice for 3 million years. Nothing has touched it. No wind, no rain, no organism that requires light for any part of its life cycle. The subglacial lakes that radar surveys have identified, there are several, kept liquid by geothermal heat from below and the pressure of 2 miles of ice from above, may contain microbial life that has been isolated from the surface biosphere for an equivalent period. Scientists have extracted water samples from adjacent systems. The results suggested living organisms. The full picture of what's in those lakes remains completely open. You might assume that by this point in the conversation, the pattern is clear. It's always either too dangerous, too remote, or too cold. Here's the one that breaks that assumption. The Hang Son Doong cave system in Vietnam was discovered by a local farmer in 1991. He reportedly heard wind coming from an opening in the forest floor, felt the updraft, decided the opening was frightening enough to walk away from, and didn't mention it to any outside researchers for 18 years. When a British caving team finally entered it in 2009, they found a cave large enough to fit a 40-story building inside its main chamber. Not a chamber that's large by cave standards. A chamber with its own internal weather system. Clouds form inside it when the temperature differential between the floor and the ceiling reaches the right conditions. Only a small number of expeditions have been permitted inside since the initial survey. The Vietnamese government has tightly controlled access, limiting the number of visitors per year to a figure that serious researchers describe as prohibitively small. Large sections of the cave's known passages have never been walked by any scientist. Beyond the surveyed area, further passages have been identified by airflow patterns, the same physical cue that led the farmer to the entrance in 1991, that no person has followed. The cave contains its own jungle, an isolated ecosystem of plants, growing in the sections where the ceiling has collapsed enough to allow light to enter, that has been developing in conditions of near total separation from the surface world for long enough that researchers have documented species not found in the surrounding forest. The Tepuis of Venezuela are something that looks wrong when you first see a photograph of them. They are flat-topped sandstone mountains, some of them the size of small cities, rising abruptly out of the surrounding jungle to heights of almost 10,000 feet. The sandstone they're formed from is some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet. Dating back roughly 1.7 billion years, the edges drop away vertically on all sides, which means the tops are not mountains in any conventional sense. They're isolated plateaus, completely separated from the surrounding ecosystem by walls of sheer rock that nothing without wings has crossed in millions of years. Angel Falls drops from the edge of one of them. The falls are famous. The top of the tepui they fall from is not. Scientists who have reached the summits of the larger tepuis by helicopter have found ecosystems that exist nowhere else on Earth. This is not an approximation. The species living on top of these formations have been cut off from the surrounding jungle for so long, estimates run between 30 and 70 million years, that they have followed entirely separate evolutionary trajectories. There are carnivorous plants on the Tepui summits that show no clear evolutionary relationship to carnivorous plants found elsewhere on the continent. There are frogs documented only from a single summit, beetles with no known relatives, species of bromeliad recorded from one plateau and nowhere else on Earth. Of the roughly 100 named tepuis in the Venezuelan highlands, a substantial portion have never had any scientific expedition reach their summits. The accessible ones have produced enough new discoveries that researchers widely expect the unvisited ones to hold equivalent concentrations of species unknown to science. They just haven't been able to get there to confirm it. In the Bolivian Amazon, specifically the Llanos de Mojos region near the border with Brazil, lighter surveys conducted in 2022 revealed something that archaeologists had spent decades debating. The technology strips away the tree canopy from aerial scans to show bare ground underneath, and what it showed was a landscape that had been systematically engineered on a scale nobody had anticipated. There were settlements covering areas of up to 150 hectares, connected by roads, plazas, canals, and agricultural terracing extending across a region the size of a small country. The Kasarabi culture, which built this infrastructure, disappeared from the historical record before any European explorer documented them. What they built was covered by centuries of jungle growth and completely invisible to ground-level observation. Researchers had walked through parts of the region for decades without knowing what was under their feet. The part that doesn't fully resolve is what's still out there. The 2022 survey covered only a portion of the Llanos de Mojos. Adjacent areas that haven't been scanned at equivalent resolution may contain additional sites of comparable scale. The archaeologists who published the findings described what they found as the largest pre-Columbian urban occupation yet documented in Amazonia, then noted carefully that the survey area was limited. The phrase they used was tip of the iceberg. Nobody has proposed a comprehensive follow-up survey at equivalent resolution. The funding and the political will haven't materialized. Then there is the Taklamakan. It sits in the Xinjiang region of northwestern China and covers roughly 130,000 square miles, making it larger than the entire United Kingdom. The name translates, in the Uyghur language, to something close to the place you go in and don't come out of. This is not a modern description or a tourist branding exercise. The name predates any cartographic mapping of the desert by several centuries, which means the communities living around its edges had accumulated enough direct evidence of what happened to people who went in to formalize that conclusion into language and pass it forward. The interior has never been crossed by any documented expedition. The routes that have allowed people to survive the Taklamakan throughout history run along the edges, moving between oasis towns spaced at intervals that already push the limits of what is survivable with adequate preparation. Those are the Silk Road routes. The center has no water, no landmarks, no established routes, and no margin for any navigational error whatsoever. Explorers working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries documented abandoned settlements on the perimeter of the desert, Lulan, Nia, Dandenwilik, that had been covered by advancing sand over the previous 1,000 years. Aurel Stein, excavating at these sites between 1900 and 1916, recovered manuscripts, textiles, and carved wooden tablets preserved by the dry cold for over a millennium. He found silk, coins, and documents in languages that hadn't been read for 1,000 years. Those sites were at the edges. The center of the Taklamakan, the territory that no Silk Road trader, no 19th century explorer, and no modern research team has physically entered, may contain equivalent sites that have never been found because no person has been there to look. The sand has had 1,000 years, in some cases several thousand years, to cover whatever is underneath it. Satellite imagery shows anomalies in the dune patterns of the deep interior that researchers have flagged as potential archaeological features. None of those features have been verified on the ground, because getting any useful research equipment to the center remains functionally impossible under any normal logistical framework. The sand surface reaches 70 degrees Celsius in summer. There is no water within hundreds of miles of the interior. The dunes exceed 300 meters in height in the central sections and migrate continuously, meaning a route that exists in one season does not exist in the same form the following year. The desert has been mapped by commercial satellites since the 1970s. The interior has still never been physically visited by any documented expedition. These two facts coexist in the scientific literature without any apparent tension, because everyone involved understands the logistical problem. The people who gave the desert its name did so without satellites or GPS or any instrument we would now consider a baseline requirement for visiting somewhere genuinely difficult. They still figured it out. They named it correctly, and then they stayed on the edges, which is all anyone has managed to do since. That's all for today. I'll be making more videos like this one, so subscribe if you don't want to miss them.